I'm Rebecca Lavoie, and we're discussing the new true crime podcast, The Lost Kids, on this edition of Crime Writers On. Joining me to get that done and more is my real-life husband and true crime co-author, former TV journalist Kevin Flynn. Hello, Kevin.
Hello, Rebecca.
Also with us is journalist, true crime author, former defense investigator, licensed private investigator, and my favorite certified cat lady, Laura Bricker. Hello, Laura.
Hello. Yeah, that's me. Crazy cat lady.
And finally with us, our captain of woke cynicism, the author behind the noir novels known as the City Trilogy, and the host of the hit UFO podcast Strange Arrivals, and our Patreon book club host, Toby Ball. Hello, Toby.
Hello, Rebecca.
So, Kevin, big doings in our house this week.
Does it have to do with my haircut?
No, you mean your
Which I haven't had.
Your lack of hair. I haven't had one either. Look at the grays.
I'm starting to look like Christopher Christopherson.
Chris Christopherson.
Chris Christopherson. Was that his name?
We were watching that History Channel show last night about Ulysses S. Grant.
Yeah.
I got to go with Ulysses S. Grant for that's the look you're going for.
I'm getting there.
I've got the man
At
bun
least you're
going.
president of the right side.
Got a man
I've got a
bun?
man bun. Yeah, it's pretty good. It's getting pretty long. It's really, and it's functional because then I don't have to do anything. I just put it in the man bun.
Laura, I hate to break it to you. I think that's just called a bun.
When you have it, it's just a bun.
Okay.
When I have it, it's a man bun.
Yeah.
Well,
do you understand, Laura, how that works?
Well, I do, but if you saw it, when you see this video at some point, you're going to realize why I'm describing it that way because it is just so subpar as a bun.
Toby, I have some bad news for you that I wanted to share.
Okay.
This week, I became more famous than you on the internet, and I just wanted to apologize.
More famous than
And I
me?
don't- Yes.
Because
and
of
it
that
was all
moth?
because yes, that moth. Do you know how many Twitter impressions that photo of a moth has?
It's like more than 500,000.
25 million.
What?
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Not kidding.
Only 500,000 likes?
My
Way more than 500,000
God.
likes. Yeah, 25 million. So let me just fill people in who may not have seen this, which is like 8 people at this point. So I have this swing weekend, right? So I'm taking off Fridays and Saturdays because things are so busy at work. And we were hanging out on our deck I guess it was Thursday, and I was on a phone call with my coworker, a FaceTime call, and I saw this crazy moth on the chair across from me on my deck. And
Crazy moth, like he was drooling and googly
no,
eyes?
it was
or?
like bright yellow and pink. It looked like an ice cream cone with like sherbet and like strawberry.
Banana and strawberry.
And lemon and like raspberry sherbet. So I turned my FaceTime phone around and showed my coworker Dan. I was like, look at this moth. And he was like, oh my God. And then I yelled into the house and I was like, Kevin, you have to come out and see this, Kevin. So Kevin, who, can't yell back because of his vocal challenges, like 5 minutes later comes out in the deck and he's like, you were yelling for me. What's the matter? What's going on? And I'm still on the FaceTime call with my friend Dan. And I'm like, look at that moth, Kevin. And Kevin, you literally threw your hands up in the air.
Oh my God.
Stormed away.
Looked up for a moth.
Yeah.
So then, because Kevin was not impressed with the moth, because Kevin was not impressed with the moth, I was like, I think this moth is more impressive than Kevin does, and I'm going to see if the internet thinks it is too. So I took an Instagram photo of the moth, and then I tweeted that, you can sync your Instagram and Twitter, so it went on Twitter too, and 25 million impressions later, it's been picked up by television news outlets all over the world. It's been written up in publications all over the world, including a couple of like content farms.
Mm-hmm.
I'm huge in Canada, the Canadian Weather Channel, whatever it's called, and the Canadian Weather Network.
Hey.
Used my photo. Bored Panda, the Dodo, like every place that makes viral content. Celebrities have liked it. The biggest one was Tyler, the Creator. Which my friends and my kids were very impressed by. And
Dee Snider from Twisted Sister.
from Twisted Sister,
What?
which you would appreciate, Toby. Yep.
Wow.
And it's been a week.
He's a
My
big
moth.
moth fan.
Wow.
It's a moth.
Yeah. And you know what I didn't do?
Mention the podcast and all.
Because I have like no, I mean, I understand how this is supposed to work. When you have something that goes viral, you're supposed to like change your whole Twitter bio to promote all the stuff you want people to see. Mm-hmm. But I know better because I know the only reason people are clicking on my profile is to see moth stuff. So I didn't want to be like, hey, listen to my true crime podcast, guys. I thought that was tacky, and it's in my bio anyway. Yeah.
I mean, I just have turkeys in my yard. No moths. So, and like crazy bird frog things. I don't know. You guys noticing like the birds are like super loud this year? Or is it just
Those are the chipmunks, Laura.
Yeah, those aren't birds.
No, seriously.
They're chipmunks.
Everyone thinks it's birds, but it's actually chipmunks. They sound like birds, but there's so many of them because they sound like a swarm of birds, but it's actually chipmunks.
Wow.
Listen again.
Okay.
You know, we had
acorns everywhere.
We had a fisher cat in our backyard 2 nights ago.
No one knows what that is who doesn't live in New England.
Well,
no one
it's
knows.
like
scary.
I don't even know how to describe it. It's kind of like a bobcat, I guess.
It's like
no,
a weasel.
it looks like a weasel. I thought it was an otter when I saw one across the road.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it makes a noise like, I don't know, like a very small woman screaming. And it's a little alarming the first time you hear it, and you're like, oh, okay, that's a fisher cat. But now we got to make sure that our like house cats are inside before the sun goes down.
Yeah. So we've got bears, chipmunks, moths, and we've gone viral. It's all very exciting.
Wow. Yeah.
And we're still making this podcast, which is even the most exciting of all. Yeah. So that being said, you guys ready to start our review?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Leading off. In 2004, Daniel Yuen's parents sent him to a therapeutic boarding school, which promised to help their troubled teen. But days later, the 16-year-old ran away and disappeared into the San Bernardino Mountains. In The Lost Kids from UCP, journalist Josh Block explores the underregulated industry of tough love programs, and in particular, the Southern California facility known as CEDU, and its historical connections to a dangerous cult. Now, Kevin, you know where we know journalist Josh Block from, right?
Yeah, he did Escaping Nexium.
Yes. I love him. I love his hosting style. Uh-huh. I think his reporting is really thorough. What do you think of him as an anchor for a podcast like this?
Oh, I think he's really good. He certainly takes a story with significance and does like he did at the CBC, where he takes a story of significance and then wraps it in this true crime idea, so people think they're listening to true crime, but they're actually listening to really important investigative piece. Mm-hmm. And so that's, it starts off with the disappearance of Daniel, and that's an important story that they get that they will come back to by the time they get to the end. Mm-hmm. But it's a much more thoughtful look at this whole industry around so-called troubled teens,
right,
and about the different, boarding school type, wilderness adventure type programs that are supposed to, scare them straight and get them back to what their mom and dad want.
Well, it's an industry. I mean, that's something that the podcast points out again and again. And I think anybody who's a parent who's had a kid who's, maybe like been less successful in a situation than you wanted them to be or whatever, can 100% relate to the idea of being at your wit's end, and you will do anything, just to help your kid get over something. And in the case of the Yuens, like, they want him to graduate high school. They want him to be happy. They're not saying like, we want to throw you away. They're saying like, we want to help save you. Like, Laura, don't you relate to that kind of like, that feeling as a parent that you really would, if you can afford it, do whatever you can to help your kid?
Oh, absolutely. And I have to tell you, I have Googled these places. I have a teenage boy, like some other people do. And, and they look great online. And that's what I sort of took away listening to this podcast, listening to the way that Daniel's parents remember how it seemed like this sort of great white hope for them. And everybody felt so optimistic. Yep. And you see their websites, and there's these kids, they're like, we're out in wilderness, doing like wilderness trekking with small teams and therapeutic instruction and all this. But then, holy wow, if you look up how much these places cost, like it's like $75,000 a year or more for some of these programs. Yep. And it's a real, so that's what's interesting, is that you have to think about, you've got people that are, maybe not willing, but that find a way to shell out that amount of money And then to have situations like this, because this has happened at other places. I mean, this isn't the only school of this type where something like this has happened. To have these situations happening, it's just, it's amazing that we haven't heard more about these kind of places and stories like Daniel's.
No, I don't disagree with you. Toby, the podcast starts and we do meet the Yuens, and they talk us through how they got to a place where they decided to bring their son to this school. And they even talk about, talking to him about going there and getting enough buy-in that he was willing to go check it out. And they sound so sincere, and they're so believing that, something could help them. I mean, we hear that they dipped into their 401k. But the first thing that we hear about this program is that they have this approach where they just want to tear the kid down, make them tell the truth, get them to their basest self so that they can become the person that they're supposed to be. When you hear that, Toby, what do you think? Just when you hear the very basics of the philosophy of a program like that.
I'm not wildly enthusiastic about it. One of the weird things about this, and I guess these other sort of therapeutic programs, there's a wide range of them. I have friends who went and did NOLS, which is the National Outdoor Leadership School, which my impression is pretty legit, and they weren't having people screaming at them and depriving them of food and making them not swat red ants off them or whatever. But the idea that, and you find this out later in the podcast, that you're basically making a curriculum or at least a philosophy of a curriculum for teenagers based on this pretty radical, hard drug program that was basically a cult. It's, to me, that just on the face of it seems sort of wrong-headed. And they do talk about how, when you're a teenager, you're still having personality formation, right? That it isn't developed. So you're tearing down something that's in the process of being built. And, just on the face of it, and I'm not a clinician or anything like that, but
neither were these guys, Toby.
Yeah, well, exactly. So that we're all in the same boat here. And, but it would give me pause to think maybe I should know a little bit more before I start doing this.
Right.
It seems like there were more psychologists involved with setting up the curriculum for Sesame Street than there was for this program. And and I think it was very telling. We get to episode, I think it's 3, where we hear from a former counselor, staff member, faculty. We don't even really know. Randall, who had no experience in education or social work. And he kind of said something towards the end of the interview about how, well, this isn't a therapeutic setting. Right. And you're like, well, what is it then?
Right. And we should say, by the way, I don't want to give the impression that any of us think that all therapeutic programs for teenagers are this, because this is about a very specific type of program and a specific place. CEDU is the place profiled in this podcast where apparently a bunch of celebrities sent their kids, including Paris Hilton went to this place, which really surprised me to hear. And Roseanne Barr sent her kids there. He says
Barbara
that in the first episode of the and there are, like Laura, I've Googled these places too, and there are very legitimate, very therapeutic programs that surround kids with support in addition to the real academic setting and help them prepare not just for college but just to be healthy community building individuals and help them through recovery or different issues that they have. And then there are still places to this day, I know of one in our neighboring state of Maine, I'm not going to name it, where they are still having kids dig holes and having them snitch on each other. Wow. And community policing in the community of kids is the philosophy of how to build character. Tell on your fellow student if you see them breaking the rules. And it's really something. And it does not surprise me to hear that the rules at places like this and at CEDU are, you're not going to hear from your kid for a couple weeks after they get here. You're not going to allow them to contact you. And when they contact you, they're going to tell you they hate it, and here's what you're supposed to say when they tell you that. Is it at all a surprise, Laura Bricker, that dozens of kids ran away from this particular program in California? Maybe hundreds of kids ran away.
No, but I mean, when I hear about the kids running away and then I hear the description of this place, it's like something out of like a bad horror movie. It's like on this mountain and it's like out in the middle of nowhere and they're cut off from the rest of the world, basically. Like you're totally isolated. It's like I can just envision, trying to get away from this place in, the wilderness, basically, is what it sounds like. But it struck me that not only are the kids running away, but that so many are running away, they have a PI on call to keep up with this. Like, seriously, like a whole cottage industry has sprung out of this initial school.
Well, I mean, these hundreds ran away. Doesn't mean hundreds ran away and never came back.
Right.
Seems like a lot of kids ran away and
but
came back.
But it seems like an unknown number were never found.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's hard to...
More than one.
Well,
I saw 3 in something I read.
Yeah, but it seems like, and Josh certainly makes the case, that the organization seemed to be pretty laissez-faire about going about finding kids when they've left the facility. Now, Laura's right. You have this place up in the mountains, and you see where there's kids running away.
Like the Overlook Hotel.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's like building a daycare right next to a highway, and there's no fence in the yard. Now, it's okay for me, but for a bunch of 5-year-olds, could be a lot of problems.
No, yeah. I completely agree. I mean, Toby, when I heard at CEDU that they had these group sessions, and first of all, the fact that they call them RAPs is ridiculous. That's like exactly what you'd call something for teenagers, for their parents to think that they were doing something cool, right?
Right.
But then you hear what they actually are, and they're basically, you have to, the whole thing is built around disclosure. Say everything, quote unquote, horrible that you've ever done. And it sounds like for a lot of these kids, the quote unquote horrible things that they've done are basically just like teenage activity, exploring their sexuality, staying out late. Some of the kids, were, experimenting or involved with drugs and alcohol and so forth. But, it seemed like there was a spectrum. But
sounds like the worst episode of Zoom ever. Bye, Frabben,
But here you are, you have these, children basically having to disclose. When he talked about, at the cliffhanger about it being like tied to a cult. Toby, what was the first cult that you thought of? Did anything spring into your mind?
NXIVM.
Oh, I thought about Scientology, but yes, also NXIVM. You're absolutely right, Toby. What is it about cults? Why do they make people do that?
Why is Josh Block always talking about cults?
Well, when I didn't realize that he was the one who did the NXIVM, and then when you mentioned that at the beginning of the broadcast, I was like, oh, that's really funny, because I had put a note about how it was sort of NXIVM-ish in that, it acts in a lot of the ways that a cult acts, but without having like sort of the supernatural aspect to it. It's more the sort of mind control aspects of things, buying into a program rather than buying into, somebody as being a god or whatever. Yeah, I'm sorry. What was the question?
The question is, why do cults do this? Why do cults do this thing where they make you disclose everything and say the worst things about you? I mean, in Scientology, we've heard over and over again that that's what auditing is, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
You go in, you have to disclose, and just obviously some question about in Scientology whether that's being recorded,
right?
And being then later used as compromise against members. But then, we heard about it in NXIVM that they would make you disclose a horrible secret that then they would use against you. And in this, it's also just this sense of just like disclosure. Like,
right.
Was that about power? What is that about?
Well, I think it's probably power for the people who are running it, but I think it's sort of presented, and people who are in it think of it as like a bonding experience, right? Where, I'm sort of psychologically naked in front of everybody, and likewise they are with me. And what other situations do you have in your life where you have like similar openness, right? So that I think it becomes...
You mean besides making a podcast?
Besides making, of course, because I do disclose all my darkest and most troubling secrets.
We all do.
Toby, I did last week. Oh my gosh.
You did. And I'm still struggling with it. So I think that's as far as building sort of group dynamics and sort of a loyalty to each other, which I think, it's a complicated psychological thing. If you're just going to be putting people on blast all the time and having them not fleeing, there's got to be a reason for them to stay, a reason for them to, buy into what's going on. And I think part of it is, and you get that, you get a similar thing in team sports sometimes, depending on your coach. But, the coach puts you through a lot in practice and training, with the idea being that it's a bonding thing. Like you're brought together through sort of, suffering isn't quite the word, but collective toil.
Suffering. That sounds right to me.
There's also the same thing happens at boot camp or basic training in the military,
exactly.
Where you're broken down and it's very physically and mentally abusive, but there is a curriculum to it and it builds you up for that purpose. So I'm not surprised that
it's also a choice.
Well, no, that's true,
there.
right? So I'm not surprised that some kids would go to a program like this and get something out of it, but it's not for everybody.
Well,
and certainly for the people, and it's like they weren't screening. If you're coming in,
they weren't screening for mental health issues.
Yeah.
That's for sure. I just kept thinking that, like, this is the thing about teenagers, and this is the thing that, we've talked about with kids in our own family. It's like, as adults, and there's a beautiful part of the podcast where he talks to an expert that addresses this. So much of teenage behavior is so confounding to adults, right?
Yeah.
But a huge part of that is, first of all, because we push back against the idea that kids become adults. And they're becoming adults when they live with us, and that's hard. Mm-hmm. So, there are things that kids do in the process of growing up that is icky to us, it's sort of naturally icky. We don't want to know about our kids having sex or whatever. And the way a lot of parents deal with that is just to say it can't happen, which is not healthy, but that's what a lot of parents do. The other thing that happens is that we sometimes, what we're calling teenage behavior is actually a symptom of depression or mental illness. We accept as adults that all of our friends have depression and take medication and so forth. But when we see a teenager doing something annoying, we don't ask that question immediately. We're just oh, it's teenage stuff. He's just being rebellious. He doesn't want to get out of bed. He's not taking showers or whatever. Those are all symptoms of mental health issues. And at this place, there was no support for that, no counseling. Yeah. Not cool.
Well, I think that one of the things is the parents are as much victims as the kids are.
In this
They're
instance,
being
yes.
fleeced,
yeah.
And certainly being preyed upon, because what parent doesn't want to do something for their kid, especially if they feel like they're unable to, fix a certain situation, or they can't get their kid to stop being depressed or stop running around late at night. I mean, I think it was great that episode 1 opens up with this montage from daytime talk shows where the subject is oh, my kid is out of control.
Yeah.
And they send him to boot camp, and the kid comes back.
I love you, Mommy.
Yeah. And I'm thinking is this what this podcast is going to be like? And instead, it was way more thoughtful and dug down a lot deeper.
Laura sounds like she wants to say something.
I want to talk about that creepy smooshing thing that they were doing.
Yes.
What was that about? I mean, it was listening to that part of it, the absolute, we were talking about before, the sort of, beat you down, mind control, sort of psychological aspect of this place. That was the most disturbing thing, where they're and then they had to lay with their counselor, who wasn't really a counselor's head, in their lap and pet their hair and stuff. And I'm who thought that was a good idea and why? Anyone else? Totally. Yeah. I was just so disturbed by that particular detail.
I was disturbed by that. And go ahead, Toby.
I was just going to say that's another culty type thing. I mean, they're not, actually having sex, but it's the Manson family, he used to kind of have them do that, but in a more X-rated version. And I, even when we were talking about Wild Wild Country, where they see that movie, the townspeople see that movie with these weird sort of kind of violent group sexual encounters. Do you remember this?
Oh, yeah.
And they all kind of freak out. They're like, oh, these are the guys who are moving in next to us. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of from the cult handbook.
Oh, yeah.
But as Josh describes, like part of the thing with the kids is that there's to be no sexual relationships and no sexual tension.
Right.
Toby, you hear me? No sexual tension.
You can get in trouble for sexual tension on this podcast, Toby.
You're going to throw a bunch of 15 and 16-year-olds onto the floor and have them rolling around, putting their head in each other's laps and stroking their hair, and nothing's going to pop up?
Yeah.
I'm just saying. I'm
saying, so the thing about Uncover Escaping NXIVM, which I believe we all really liked, if my memory serves me correctly. Yep. The one flaw I had with that podcast, and I don't remember if you guys shared any part of that, was was like a single source podcast. It wasn't a single source, but it depended very heavily on one source. Josh Bloch's friend who had
who's in the cult,
escaped NXIVM. Yeah. And of course, there were also a few other people in it too, giving some context, but it was mostly her. Here we have multiple accounts from multiple adults who experienced this place. We have the accounts of the parents, we have the accounts of the expert, and then we have 2 former employees, including one of the head honcho guys, Rudy, who was like basically the counselor, whatever, educator in charge of the place when a lot of these kids were there who are now adults. Toby, what did you think of the fact that he was able to score this incredibly thoughtful interview with Rudy? I don't think Josh pulled any punches, and I kind of think Rudy didn't either in some ways. What did you think about that part of the podcast?
Yeah, it was a great interview. I thought Rudy's attitude towards the whole thing was pretty interesting in that I think he was willing to concede that, in hindsight, some, if not a lot of the stuff they were doing was probably questionable. But what I thought was kind of, at least I didn't pick up on it, was that he was in any way kind of repentant about it or kind of felt bad in any way. It was just kind of, oh yeah, looking back on it, we probably shouldn't have done that. But he didn't seem too troubled by that. So I thought that was, and he certainly was put forward as having the reputation as being, as aggressive in this tearing down aspect of things as anybody there. And the way he tried to kind of spin it, again, it seemed, that kind of seemed to be one of those, the lies you tell yourself to make it easier. But it didn't. The impression that you get about what actually happens is not that you're just trying to dig out some truths about somebody or about the way they feel about themselves. It's, that one woman who I think her name was Aaliyah, maybe.
Yes.
Who, she was there for 2.5 years.
Yes.
Which I just couldn't wrap my head around.
After being called a whore, and the whole thing was she was supposed to accept that she was a whore.
Yeah, it's sort of reinforcing this thing that the way she acted, was whorish.
Yes.
And
your
and
note
he
on
makes
this,
it
by
seem
the
like,
way, is amazing. Toby sent a note and saying, "I can't believe she was there for 2.5 years. It's like she got an associate's degree and thinking she was a slut."
Oh,
but
I mean.
Yeah.
Funny, but also sad and poignant.
No, 100%. And it's, the way he kind of tries to frame it is, if this is the way you think about yourself, we need to pull that out. And the way she told it was, they kind of waited and, they kind of made it so that I had to say it. Right. Yeah. And then that was my label.
Yep. Laura, have you ever heard of this Synanon cult before?
I hadn't heard of that cult. I did look it up because I was curious about it. And it was interesting, that there was this background to this school where people that, came from that cult, which was like a pretty hardcore, sounds like drug and alcohol, tough love kind of place, then started this school. And so I was like, as soon as I heard that, I'm like, oh my gosh, all I can think of is Toby. And like, there's always a cult angle. Always a cult angle. And, But that was really interesting, like the history portion of this, where we actually went back to, what was it, like the 60s when this was sort of, and they were talking about like the people that were hanging around this place, sort of legitimizing it, and then how that sort of, grew to this offshoot with this school for, therapeutic community for the teens. And then if you look this place up, the CEDU school, I mean, they had a lot of schools in different places, and all of them, again, were in these like super remote locations.
That's right.
Yeah, it was, which again makes me think
then the kids can't leave.
Makes me think of a cult, like being out, like, okay, you're way out here, you can't get away. And
your parents can't come see you.
It's like that story. I think I've told this before about my cousin Dwight and his friend, his roommate from college, and how they got taken in by the Moonies when they were like backpacking around their summer off from college. And Dwight he was like an Eagle Scout, and he's like, I think something's funny here. But the Moonies, first of all, they were like making them harvest zucchini for like days. He said he was off zucchini for like 10 years after that. But they partner you up with like some attractive person who's like your handler. And so his friend Steve didn't want to leave because he had this like very attractive girl. And then they like took his clothes to do his laundry, and Steve's like, I can't leave. They have my clothes. And so Dwight got out, and they actually busted. But it was like the same sort of thing. Like
if you want to hear more of this story, you have to subscribe to Patreon and listen to Laura's Leave It to Bricker podcast, because she goes into this.
Well, that's true. She does.
But what he was talking about was like they took him to this farm that was like out in the middle of nowhere in California. It was like the same thing, and it's like, there was nobody around. And so that when you hear about the cult angle of this story, again, it sort of fits all of those sort of, patterns. And but I want to talk about that private eye guy. Can we talk about him?
That was going to be my final thing I wanted to talk about, because we do meet the private detective who was put in charge of trying to find Daniel for his poor parents. And he has a lot of different stories about, what may have happened to him. He says he talked to people who, without getting too much into spoiler area, think different things may have happened to him. He may be alive. He may not be alive. Who knows? But he is also so full of it. Is he not? With his, it's always bad when you're trying to get someone on the phone and they just keep telling you they can't talk to you because they're dying. And then they keep telling you that over and over again. They're like, for how long could you possibly be dying?
And then your stepbrother
writes back from the same email address.
Yeah.
So, Laura, you think that private eye, as a private eye yourself, what do you think of him? Do you think he was maybe a little bit shady?
It was hard because you want to assume the best intentions when you hear somebody say that this is the case that haunted them. This is like the one that got away, the one that's always been on their mind. But then the way that it lined up so perfectly that he starts, he's dying. It's like a bucket list. And then mysteriously, just because he comes back in all these years later in 2019, so it was like 2004 when Daniel disappeared, and there was no information all those years. And then suddenly, 2019, he gets this phone call that the guy, Daniel, is still in the area. And then, oh my God, amazing. He goes down to the pier and somebody has just seen him there. I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, really?
Yeah. Well, he heard that someone was going to do a podcast about it.
I just kept thinking, I just kept thinking, Toby, didn't you just keep thinking, like, if theoretically you are a shady PI with a cottage industry in looking for runaway kids on behalf of this very sketchy school, would you not, perhaps, if you were shady, give the parents a more hope than perhaps there was a reason to have, so that they would keep paying you to do this investigation?
Oh yeah, 100%. It reminded me, and I think Rebecca, you and Laura weren't on this episode, but that Maddie, whatever her name is, who
McCann.
Yeah, Maddie McCann. Like there was a private eye who was in that, who did sort of a similar thing, which is kind of just keep enough hope there to keep milking the money out, without actually, making any real headway on the case, or even, expecting to make any real headway. You just keep giving kind of, vague reports. to keep the money flowing.
I got a lead. It's going to be 10 grand for you to find out what it is. All right. Well, I think we should do what we do. Let's let folks know, should they check out the new true crime mystery / reported journalism podcast, The Lost Kids? Thumbs up or thumbs down? Laura Brigger, I'm going to start with you. What do you think?
This is a big thumbs up. This was a super interesting story. And so the way that it was framed narratively with like the introduction, focusing on Daniel's story, and then the background into the industry and like cult background. And then there's some wrap up with current events, but it was just really well told. And we had a lot of interesting people to listen to. And it reminded me, we had a place like this in the town I grew up in. A reform school where Michael Skakel went for a period of time.
Ooh. Scandal.
I know. So I've kind of been fascinated by that generation. Of course, that was in the 80s, but that sort of reform school, therapeutic school industry is kind of interesting. And this was really shedding light on an angle that we haven't heard a lot about. So I would say thumbs up.
Toby Ball, what about you? Thumbs up or thumbs down for The Lost Kids?
Yeah, I give it a big thumbs up as well. I think it's well reported. I think it's, it gets into some interesting ideas about, how do you deal with, or I guess I should say, how do you not deal with troubled kids? The history, the stuff about Synanon was really good. There's some pretty sort of intense and affecting interviews. So overall, I thought it was, very, very good.
What about you, Kevin Flynn? Thumbs up or thumbs down for The Lost Kids?
I thought this was an amazing story. I'm a thumbs up. Josh Block just keeps, really coming up with some powerful podcast series. So all sort of on the same theme there. You've got NXIVM, which is a cult, and this, which you can say is definitely kind of a cult. It could have been a goofy sleuth case where we look at the missing person, Daniel Yuen. Instead, that's a starting point to look at a bigger issue, and he never takes his eye off the ball, what the real story is. And it's about this under-regulated industry that takes advantage not only of parents writing checks, but kids who need some legitimate help or could at least benefit from a legitimate curriculum to handle their issues. So for me, it's a thumbs up.
Thumbs up for me too. I'll tell you one thing we didn't talk about a lot. This podcast is beautifully produced. The quality of even like the microphones is outstanding. The mixing is excellent. And in terms of like the writing, the reporting is very straight. They get all the people that they should have to tell the story. And it's a complicated story that is obviously centered around one family and one missing kid. One of the things I really loved about the podcast, Kevin, you mentioned that it could have gone off in like some dopey, true crime direction. They did do a lot of the things that a true crime podcast is supposed to do. They visited the scene of the crime. They went on a little bit of like a road trip to sort of go to the place this was. They followed a young woman who had run away to sort of see her journey. And it was all perfect. It was done with purpose, and it was perfect. It was not a situation where it was like, okay, here we go, because this is what true crime podcasts are supposed to do. No, we actually learned something from that journey, and we learned something every time we took a turn. So I just think The Lost Kids was great. It was interesting, beautifully reported, and yes, dare I say, an entertaining listen. So for me, huge thumbs up. So does that wrap it up for us, Kevin?
It does, unless you have more to say.
Well, that does do it for us for the review this week. So you can follow us, Crime Writers on all the social media, including Facebook and Instagram, and our amazing Facebook discussion group, the Crime Writers On podcast, Let's Discuss. That's where you can find it. I encourage you to join that community and also get bonus podcasts plus our after show at patreon.com/partners in crime media. To listen to the full episode of this show, which includes a whole other review, subscribe to our show. Just look for Crime Writers On, True Crime Review on your favorite podcast app or wherever you listen to podcasts. On behalf of all the crime writers, Laura, Toby, Kevin, and myself, thank you so much for listening.